What is up, guys? Somehow you have 1 hour left to lock in the MLB. Even though the day is just starting here on the West Coast, baseball will never rest for you, and neither will the Awesemo YouTube channel. But I'm Chris Spags, joined by a man who is well equipped to help me through the straggling that my brain will do at this point in the morning. You know him, you love him. He's Greg Ehrenberg. How you doing, Greg?
Oh, you got an extra hour of rest today, too, because you normally be doing the show at 11, but baseball acclimating to your West Coast schedule, letting you sleep an extra hour.
Oh, so generous. So I was planning on doing the four corners between, but then I realized we have the tip off at 12 p.m. West Coast time, which I have to prep NBA for, an 11-game slate in addition to another MLB slate to include there. So no four corners today, but this schedule is just madness. I feel like there's, especially just waking up, you just throw yourself right into the fray. There is no breathing room for anything we have with our MLB content.
Not at all. And by the way, one other thing that I'm going to mention before we start here is that the Fanduel early slate 4 games, Draftkings slate 5 games. Draftkings randomly decided to include the doubleheader game, which is only a 7-inning game. That also something else that we're going to have to talk about. But yeah, weird, because Draftkings has not been including doubleheader games. In fact, they had a doubleheader game on the slate yesterday, and they're like, "Hey, don't roster anybody from this game. They will all accrue 0 fantasy points." And say like, "No, this one counts." So I don't know why the pivot.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm sure our Awesemo projection system will account for that, but definitely something that you guys out there, for some reason, you're making your own projections or using some from some other site. Keep that in mind today, that the Boston-Minnesota game does have a doubleheader, and also the pitchers in this one, it's Eovaldi and Maeda for the early game. So make sure on Fantasy Cruncher as well, you are selecting the right guys for that one. But we will talk about all this stuff here. We'll go game by game for the 5-game early slate, or 4-game early slate on FanDuel, as Greg just mentioned. But hit that like button, guys. It helps out a bunch here. Make sure to come back later today for the main slate live before lock show with Terry, Alex, and Max coming up 4 p.m. Eastern. And also make sure to check out all of our stuff going on at OddsShopper. It's really a big asset to what you're doing in terms of sports betting. If you're playing DFS every day, you should be checking out OddsShopper, because they're updating the lines as they go. As anything changes out there, you're going to see the best line you could possibly find in all the sports books out there. And really, it's going to be a major part of what you're doing, whether it be straight bets, player props, all those things. So go to oddshopper.awesemo.com. They compile the best bets and game lines, player props, team futures, all that stuff in real time. Big asset to what you're doing. I know Greg has done a good job as well with his money on OddsShopper. So that's another cosign here that Greg doesn't even have to give you. I'll just say it for him, because that's the kind of relationship we have where I could talk for him like he's a kept woman. We can also talk real fast about the Awesemo Hall of Fame. This is something that we're pushing a little bit more. I know our pal Waffy very big on making sure that we're chronicling the success of you guys. So if you do happen to have a big night in DFS using our tools, advice, or content, give us a shout on Twitter by tagging any of our hosts or Awesemo social media handles, in particular the @Awesemo HOF account, where they'll be compiling winning screenshots from the Awesemo Plus community. And there's also the avatar deal. You finish in the top 3, I believe, in a tournament over 5,000 people. You can get a free month of Awesemo Plus. So lots of ways here to show your pride in being an Awesemo member, and also brag a little bit and get some free things out of it. So check out the Awesemo HOF handle and send in your screenshots in there if you've been doing well. I know a lot of people having some success early on here in the MLB season, so make sure to check that out. Let's get into the games though, Greg, and I guess any overarching thoughts for you on the slate, where it's going to be a different one because, as you mentioned, the 4-gamer on FanDuel, 5 games on DraftKings, but just any sort of things that popped up to you from what you've done in your lineup build so far?
So the one thing that, I mean, you mentioned it right there, is that there being a 7-inning game on the slate, where it is kind of hard to account for that. Like it's really hard to know, like, what do I do with stacks here? So I hardly have any stacks of the Red Sox or the Twins. I have some one-offs of individual players. Something else to note is that I like to use the top stacks tool on Awesemo.com a lot. And the top stacks tool does not differentiate between 7-inning or 9-inning games. So I just kind of manually gave a little downgrade to any of the teams that are in there in terms of their odds of being top scoring team, which even as is was not very high for the Red Sox or the Twins. So I kind of wish that we had a little bit more synchronicity, where FanDuel and DraftKings were like, hey, we're not going to include any 7-inning games, just because I find them to be kind of a headache to deal with, and I don't really totally know how to handle them.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I do think the projections account for it, just looking at them, as I am right now, because only a 3% chance of Minnesota being the top stack, or excuse me, of Boston being the top stack going against Kenta Maeda. That feels low. A 2.7 implied total here as well. Like the Vegas total seems to be accounting for it. And then also you have Nelson Cruz only projected for 7.4, Byron Buxton projected for 7.6 points. So that seems to me like going against Nathan Eovaldi, I would think these guys would have a little bit higher projection. So I'm pretty confident we're accounting for it, but I agree. Like these are guys that you're probably not going to get to a lot of. And maybe, I guess the question would be, Greg, would you just take them out of the player pool entirely?
No, I mean, I have them as one-offs, right? Because anybody could hit anybody
Yeah.
could hit a home run or whatever, find success. But one of the things is also, so there's a very clear number one. Now we have to talk about DraftKings. We're talking about the 7 inning game, so this only applies to DK. But there's a very clear SP1 in Corbin Burns, and that's for FanDuel and DraftKings. It's really hard to get away from him. He's in the majority of my lineups. But then beyond him, I think Kenta Maeda and Nathan Eovaldi are still the second best. I think those are the next best pitching options on DK. So they're in my player pool, and I do have some of these guys as one-offs, the bats, except not a significant amount of exposure to any one player from the Twins or the Red Sox. It's just a bunch of guys. It's like, hey, I have 2% of this guy, 3% of that guy, because it does hurt them that over the course of the game, we're probably expecting these guys, have one less at bat. So it doesn't totally translate to NBA, but still think that it's the equivalent of a player who we're giving, 3 or 4 less minutes to. It's going to lower their overall projection.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And got a question in the chat already from the curse of the blitzing. Could a starting pitcher still not get in like 90 plus pitches in a 7 inning game? Or are they going to rotate them out sooner? I think that's what, Greg, what you're saying here is that like these guys would be chalky today. And I would agree. The pitchers for me, like, you're not expecting Nathan Eovaldi to go 7+ innings anyway. He's been a guy who's pitched about 4 innings per start over the last couple of years. Maeda as well. Same thing for him. He's always had a notoriously quick hook, but 5 innings pitched per start. Like, these guys aren't going to get there anyway. So you're just banking on the strikeout upside in those early games, and just means a shorter bullpen day.
And also we do have some lineup news here, which is actually going to be kind of significant because the Brewers lineup is out and Christian Yelich is not in for them. And then in the Cubs lineup, there is no Chris Bryant today.
Okay, that's interesting. We also got one scratch too that Casey missed it. Ross Stripling, our news got all over it, but Stripling scratched as the Blue Jays starter. They're going back to TJ Zike. So that's one important note there. And let me just paste in this Cubs lineup so I have this for when we get there. We're going to go game by game though for the 5-gamer. So again, hit that like button, guys. It helps us out a bunch to just fight the algorithm as we do here. All the YouTube channels that are on out there. Even as a site of the size of Awesemo or channel the size of Awesemo needs your help as always. So hit that like button, helps out every show on this channel and really any content you enjoy on YouTube. Always hit the like button, leave a comment, do that stuff because it helps out everybody in the industry a bunch. Let's get into our first game here. The Yankees 5.4 implied runs going against that aforementioned TJ Zike. And Zike is a dude who's just not the biggest sample size, but shown absolutely nothing so far. Over the smaller sample size, going back to last season, a 7% K rate. Going back to 2019, a 14% K rate. He's been hit very hard by lefties. And I think, Stripling, for whatever failings he may have, a guy probably wasn't going to pitch that deep anyway. He's still more competent than TJ Zike. And I think this Yankees lineup, Greg, to me gets more appealing. And they were already having the highest probability of being the top stack on the slate.
Yeah, and I am just rerunning my lineups right now because one of my highest rostered players was DJ LeMahieu, who is not in the Yankees starting lineup. We have most of the starting lineups now, so I guess there's probably some utility in just reading off what the starting lineups are as we start to talk about the teams. The Yankees are starting Aaron Hicks, Aaron Judge, Brett Gardner, Gary Sanchez, Gleyber Torres, Jay Bruce, Gio Urshela, Rougned Odor, and then Kyle Higashioka. So the key absences here, no Giancarlo Stanton, no DJ LeMahieu for the Yankees. Those are 2 players who I would have otherwise expected to be in, but aren't. Also something that we're going to see a lot with day games over the course of the baseball season. This is often when teams like, hey, they played the night before, then they have a day game. They're going to give guys a day off. So they aren't just playing right after playing a few hours earlier. But so for the Yankees, they are my highest owned stack right now. I think they're the team that makes the most sense on FanDuel and DraftKings. Looking at the top stacks tool, like you said, we have them with a 23% chance of being the top scoring team of the day, which is by far the highest number, almost double the next highest projected scoring team in the Angels. That is for the DraftKings slate. And then if we go over to FanDuel, where there's less teams to consider because there's no Red Sox on the slate, there the Yankees have about 25% chance of being the top scoring team overall. So the Yankees definitely a priority stack for me. They are a little expensive. They are slightly overowned, except nothing that's so crazy to where the point that I'm going to be, like underweight to the field on them in a significant way or anything. The Yankees are my overall highest owned team for the day.
Yeah, and I think there are going to be some ownership projections that move around here because guys like Brent Gardner hitting in the 3 hole, Jay Bruce also it's pretty cheap hitting in the 6 hole. And is there anybody who is coming in here that you would prioritize a bit more? Like Gardner, I think the lefty matchup going against Zike. Zike has been, again, small sample size ball, but whenever there are splits like this, it's just that are egregiously bad. I do like giving a little bit more love to some of these guys. And Gardner hitting in the 3 hole against Zike, who's given up a 361 batting average, 6.7 xFIP, and not the most power, 164 ISO, but I think for a guy like Brett Gardner, that's not the worst thing in the world. I think the lefties coming into this lineup would gain an appeal for me just because they weren't here initially, and they're super cheap too. Gardner at 2,800 on DK, Jay Bruce at 3,300. Do you feel like you'd give a little more love to those guys? I guess Rougned Odor is already going to be very highly owned, but I think in some respects, I'd prefer to have Bruce, I guess, besides the first base spot you're giving up, but Gardner too. Just these guys are cheaper, hitting higher in the order, and I think as good of a hitter, if not better of a hitter than Rougned Odor.
Yeah, just because of the price. I mean, Gardner right now and just the lineups that I reran, Gardner is my most rostered hitter right now on DraftKings. I also think he's the best value play on FanDuel. He's almost min price on FanDuel. So, I mean, we just look at how cheap those salaries are. And the other thing, too, is the Yankees, overall as a stack, they've just become a lot cheaper. This was a team that when guys like Stanton was going to be in the lineup and DJ LeMahieu made the Yankees by far the most expensive team. Not really the case anymore. There's a bunch of cheap guys to go to, which makes them really easy to stack up with Corbin Burns than whoever else you want to pitch as the SP2. There's no salary constraints for this slate. So with Brett Gardner hitting third, I think that he's definitely one of the top plays on the slate. He's probably going to be really popular because of the price and the batting order, but it makes sense to me.
And then I guess I have to ask the question, just because of the ownership going to the Yankees, the fact that they are such a clear-cut #1 team, and it's still possible for a team to fail even when they're in an ideal spot. We've seen that sometimes happen here with MLB DFS start the year. Obviously, happens all the time. Any world in which you're going to TJ Zike, given the fact that he is very much a value play. Also, I think I said the numbers. He looks terrible over whatever sample size he's had so far with that 7% strikeout rate, longer term 14% strikeout rate. But the assumption is he's a professional level player and should have some positive regression at some point. So is there any world in which you would see yourself getting a TJ Zike at all?
No, because I think he's only going to serve as an opener. If we look at him so far this year, he's made he's 2 outings, only pitched 7 1/3 innings. So let me see if I could pull up how deep he went in his last start. I mean, I know it wasn't more than 7 innings for sure, because that's what he's pitched overall. But I'm looking
overall. He's gone 4 innings per start, I think, if I have that correctly.
All right, let me just pull up his pitch count. I mean, it's also about as difficult to match up as possible. Here we go. All right, so Zike has thrown 75 and 63 pitches in his 2 outings. So I think it's reasonable to expect he's probably going to throw at max something like 80. And in a really tough matchup against the Yankees, that's just going to make it really hard for me to find upside in him. So no, I really expect he's going to serve as an opener. I wouldn't even be surprised if Ross Stripling ends up getting into the game anyway. Like Zike might legitimately only pitch 2 or 3 innings, and then Stripling comes in behind him and he just serves as an opener. We haven't seen anything official on what that's going to be, but that's kind of what my gut feeling is here.
Yeah, definitely. It's possible that can move around a little bit there, but just had to point it out because, the Yankees now do have 6 guys who strike out above league average in this lineup. And, I think if I were playing a lot of entries, if I were doing a max 150 for this, I might be inclined to get one lineup or a couple lineups of Zike just to get that leverage and the chance that maybe he does pitch a bit more. And 80 pitches, if he was working well, which he's not done at all, could be useful. But I agree, it's mostly a play that more of the theoretical than the actual. Toronto on their side, pretty high implied total for them going against Corey Kluber, who in his return to the mound has not shown very much so far. In fact, I think has shown probably he's somehow even worse than he was previously over the 2019 to present sample size, 1.7 whip for him, 5 xFIP, giving up not a ton of power, more power to lefties, but still Kluber hasn't shown very much in terms of, league average strikeout ability he has going for him. But Toronto on their side, lots of guys with power, 185 ISO overall, aggregate ISO in this lineup today. Toronto stacks, I think, appealing, though, according to the top stacks tool, are looking a bit overowned, as I guess pretty much everything is going to be today.
All right, so first starting with what's gone wrong with Corey Kluber, I think we're just seeing just a decrease in overall arm talent. His velocity was already on the decline. If you look at his velocity numbers over the last few years, he's a guy who, as he's gotten older, which is not surprising, we've seen his velocity slowly start to drop. He's gone from a guy who used to have an average fastball velocity of 93 to then the last couple of years, it's dipped below 92. And now this year, in his first couple of outings, which have not gone well at all, average fastball velocity of 89.8 miles per hour. So I don't know if he's still dealing with an injury or if it's just age catching up to him at this point, but it's pretty clear to me that Corey Kluber is not the pitcher he once was. And it's not just a matter of rust or anything like that. I mean, the velocity isn't there anymore. And it's something he's either going to have to adjust to, or he's just not going to be nearly the same pitcher, which, I mean, he's not going to be the same pitcher anyway, but he might not even be a viable big league pitcher the way it's going for him right now. But looking at some of these Blue Jays bats, I think there's a couple of things that we have to note here. Number one, to your point that as a stack, they are looking like the most overowned team on the slate right now for Fanduel. And then for DraftKings, they're also going quite a bit overowned. Right now, we have them with a, what was it here? 12.7% chance to be the top scoring team on the slate, but picking up 17.2% ownership. And while I do think it's possible that Corey Kluber is washed, like I can't definitively say he has nothing left in the tank, and people are targeting him like he's TJ Zike. And that's why I think one of the things we're seeing Toronto going a little bit overowned. It is a pitcher friendly park. I am stacking the Blue Jays, but less than the field. I do have some exposure to Corey Kluber just as a leverage point, and it doesn't take much to get overweight to the field on Corey Kluber. We're projecting for 1% ownership right now, so I put him in 7% of my lineups. Just thing where it's like, hey, maybe Corey Kluber's velocity bounces back. And the other thing too is the other pitching options suck on the slate, right? We have Corbin Burns as a clear number one. I don't feel good about any other pitching option here. Kenta Maeda to an extent, but it's a relatively tough matchup for him. And I don't want to get Kenta Maeda and Corbin Burns in all my lineups. So when I'm looking for anybody beyond those two, I mean, the option is just kind of a toss-up. So I'm overweight to the field on Corey Kluber just for a little bit of differentiation and leverage. And that if he is able to find something maybe mechanically that's able to help his velocity a little bit, it's not difficult to get overweight to the field on him.
The one thing that jumps out about Kluber is that he's been pretty unlucky with his batting average on balls in play of 470 BABIP. He's given up over the smaller term sample size going back to last year. He didn't pitch at all last season, right? Though it was just this season that he pitched.
He made one start, pitched one inning, I think, and broke his arm.
Gotcha. Yeah. So that's so. Anyway, point being, he's been very unlucky, even going back to 2019, 390 BABIP. So I think that's something that you could expect maybe will bounce back a little bit. And he's not giving up a lot of home runs. I think that's something that maybe that does regress, to the bad side for him, the positive side for hitters. But it seems to me like maybe Kluber's just a little unlucky in addition to the arm talent things that Greg's talking about. I think it's not crazy to think that Kluber could somehow regress to the mean today and be usable. So I think it's not a bad play. 9K is a tough price tag, but if you're putting in a lot of lineups, again, kind of take your stab at whoever you want in a 5-gamer. But who are the priorities for you at Toronto? Because Kluber, to me, I think the lefty splits are always going to be a little more appealing. Giving up a 200 ISO going back to 2019 to lefty hitters, which, he's not good at anything, but does give up a little more power to the left side of the plate. But really, Toronto, I think with the price points of these guys, there's nobody who jumps out as a real meaningful priority to me. These guys all hit pretty well. They all have a good amount of power, all have good WRC pluses, I guess, besides Randall Grichuk, hitting not the best against righties, but still has enough pop to get it going. Is there anybody you'd prioritize for Toronto? Because I think they all just kind of look like the same guy to me.
Rowdy Tellez, just because his price point, he is cheap on both FanDuel and DraftKings. He did a homer yesterday also. He's somebody that opens up a little bit of salary savings. So he's actually the Toronto player that I have the most exposure to. And then, his pay-up options, I have Bo Bichette mixed into lineups. I have Marcus Semien mixed into lineups. Lourdes Gurriel at a 3,000 price point on DraftKings. He's making into some of my lineups. But oddly, the guy who I have as the highest priority player right now is Rowdy Tellez, just because of where his salary is at and the potential for power upside.
I'm actually glad you said he had a home run because I had him as one of my low-owned dart throws in the four corners yesterday. Didn't play MLB, so I didn't know. But I'm proud of Rowdy. Proud that Husky boy is still doing us proud. One of the best names in baseball, I'd say.
He did it for you.
He did. I did. He was actually my wish. It was my make-a-wish for just, I'm not ill or anything. I just really just deceived the system to get Rowdy Tellez to hit one for me. People asking when's money time. Money time still coming up in 11 minutes here because there would not be a live before lock show with me if there were not money time. So we'll give you guys the top 5 owned plays on DraftKings and FanDuel, but hit that like button now. We got 370 people in this YouTube stream right now, only 50 likes. So get us to 100. I think that's a good number here. You'll feel good about yourself. I'll feel good about myself, as will Greg. That's really the win-win we have here. Let's get to our next game. We got Washington, 4 implied runs going against Adam Wainwright. St. Louis, 4.6 implied runs going against Joe Ross. This spot does seem like the Washington stack going to be mostly appropriately owned on DK, but going against Wainwright definitely has some lefty struggles. A 207 ISO giving up a 5.8 xFIP. The home run rate, 4.5%. I think to me, this spot Juan Soto would be a play that I'd prioritize even at the higher price point. Kyle Schwarber certainly able to get that home run upside that we know he's pretty much only good for at this point, hitting in the 4 hole for Washington. I think there are a lot of plays that I'd be intrigued by here on Washington's side. But again, especially the lefties. How are you feeling about Washington, or are you more inclined to go Adam Wainwright's way?
Not getting to Adam Wainwright. At this point in his career, he's been somebody who isn't really getting blown up in a lot of his starts, but there isn't enough strikeout upside for him to usually deliver much fantasy potential. Also, maybe if this was a spot where the bats were really expensive, really popular, I'd be looking to Wainwright as leverage. Except it's not really the case. They just look about appropriately owned. So for this slate, there's a lot of pitchers I'm prioritizing over Wainwright. Corbin Burns, the obvious one. Kenta Maeda, also another fairly obvious one. Then even Eovaldi, Griffin Canning, Joe Ross, Corey Kluber, just because of leverage purposes. These are all guys that are more important plays to me than Adam Wainwright. So even though it's only a 5-game slate on DraftKings, I'm still not getting to Adam Wainwright at all. There's other guys that I have ahead of him. And by the way, not to get too far off base, but just something I was thinking about that stuck in my head. So the Make-A-Wish thing, that's such an unnecessary amount of pressure to put on a player where it's like, kid, what's your dying wish? And he's like, oh, I want this guy who hits 18 home runs a season. You have to homer for me tonight. Because there's got to be a point there where it's like, what happens if I don't? Well, the kid dies. Like that's such an unnecessary amount of pressure to put on a player. We should do away with that, I think.
Well, I think they're probably discouraged from wishing for an action-based item. They're like, you want to meet the guy, you want to get a zoom from the guy, you want a signed jersey. I think asking for a home run for the most part probably doesn't happen. But there was that famous Seinfeld episode where like Kramer, I think it was like trying to get some autograph thing from a kid, and the kid wouldn't give it up unless he had a player hit 2 home runs for him. I think it was Danny Tartable or somebody like that. This is an old school reference that I don't fully remember enough with my drug-addled brain, but I feel like that's it would be nice for the kids, but I think kids at this point know they have to know about variance. If you're not teaching your child about variance, you're doing them a disservice as a parent, I'd say.
Yeah, and that's why that all kids that are young and sick should be playing DFS.
It's important. It's a good way for them to use their limited money to break open their piggy bank and play the mini max.
You don't need your medicine treatment. You need to play the mini max on DraftKings. Go play the quarter jukebox.
That's the real wish. I've honestly been making that wish every day for weeks now. But let's talk about Washington a little more. Who jumps out to you? Because I'm with you on Wainwright. I think the way that Wainwright has any appeal is if every other pitcher is terrible and Wainwright just kind of hangs in there, which he does do. He pitches fairly deep into games, about 5.7 innings pitched over, I think, the 2019 sample size. And for the most part, as Greg mentioned, not a high strikeout guy, but does limit damage pretty well. So I'm with you on that. I think Wainwright's maybe a little more playable to me, but not a guy that would be a priority by any stretch. Washington, though, I mean, are you with me that Soto is definitely deserving of chalky ownership? He's going to be over 20% owned on DK, but I really don't care. I just think there aren't a lot of bats here that I'm afraid of actively breaking open the slate. I do think Soto, with his ability, just an amazing hitter against righties, 300 ISO, 167 WRC plus, doesn't strike out a lot. I mean, and the 2020 numbers for him are even crazier, where he had a 330 ISO last year, which is insane. I just feel like Soto to me is a play that as a one-off, as part of the Washington stack, I just want to get more of than the field today.
Yeah, so Soto is a player who is popping up fairly meaningfully for me, and Trey Turner. Outside of that, though, there really aren't individual Washington players that I'm getting outside of the few Nat stacks I have. So guys like scrolling through my exposure right now, like Starlin Castro and Josh Harrison, they're both cheap enough that they're making it into some of my lineups. But nothing really significant. Really, the key to me here is going to be Juan Soto, who, like you said, expensive bat to pay up for, popular. But still, for a 5-game slate, I think there's enough talent there that it's more than warranted. Also, like you mentioned, Adam Wainwright, some of his struggles against left-handed hitting. So Juan Soto definitely fits the bill there. He's definitely one of the overall top players for me on this slate. And actually, let me look at my exposure. So yeah, the 2 bats that I'm paying up for the most on this slate are Mike Trout and Juan Soto. And then something else, a value play like Brett Gardner opening up. I think that's also something that got to me a little bit more of guys like Soto and Mike Trout.
Also, Zach Ladner saying his wife works for Make-A-Wish, definitely can only ask to meet. And people pointing out, too, is Paul O'Neill, not Danny Tartable. So that's glad to have everybody having our back on this show. That's what we're all here for, to make sure that we're getting our references correctly and we are not misreporting about Make-A-Wish. So the 2 things that we look for in every Awesemo stream. We also got a question here in the chat, about Zimmerman. Ryan Zimmerman's terrible. I think is really the main thing. Like I'm always reluctant to say the word washed with NBA. People might have heard some of my tirades about everybody in NBA DFS always going like, oh, this guy's washed. This guy's washed. Zimmerman is old, took a year off, hasn't shown anything, I think, and the numbers doesn't strike out a lot, but the power for him has dropped off of a cliff for the most part over the last couple seasons. Zimmerman hitting in a 3-hole, I think, is the main appeal there, but I just don't know that I see the bounce back being that great. But do you feel differently, Greg? Because I think just to me, Zimmerman, the price point, I get it. I just don't love him seeing the numbers here. The 138 ISO against righties is not going to do it for me today.
No, and Ryan Zimmerman, near and dear to my heart. One of the first MLB GPPs I won was Ryan Zimmerman. It was a 3-home run game. I think Steven Matz was starting for the Mets that game, and Ryan Zimmerman was like 2% owned or something like that. So I'm pro Ryan Zimmerman. I definitely have bias towards him, but I mean, he hasn't hit that poorly this year. He does have a 111 WRC plus. However, if we go back to 2019, his last full season, 89 WRC plus that year. So Ryan Zimmerman, like we said, a year off, so we don't date on him from last year. He's also going to be turning 37 later on this year. So he's older. I have him in a few national stacks just because where he's hitting in the order, but no interest in him as a one-off.
And Curse of the Blitz, I guess, referring to BVP, just BVP, not a thing to worry about too much, unless you have, like 200 at bats against the guy. And even that, I feel like maybe not the most, but he's quoting that he has home runs and that he's hit 352. I just think, Greg, you can give your BVP talks real fast. I feel like we have to give one every show because there's always somebody in the chat who's like, but it's BVP. And like, it's just not the number to look at. The longer term sample of just how a guy hits righties is going to be more valuable more often than not.
Yeah, so the other thing to consider too, Ryan Zimmerman didn't play last year. Ryan Zimmerman used to be really good, right? Adam Wainwright used to be a much different pitcher than he is now, different velocity, different pitch mix. So any information you're looking at with Ryan Zimmerman versus Adam Wainwright, you're talking about a guy who is essentially a different hitter hitting against a guy who's essentially used to be a different pitcher. And everything was different about him. Adam Wainwright, like I said, different velocity, different pitches. So there's nothing that really ties into these guys now, how they played against each other in the past.
Yeah, you're just trying to get that bigger sample size so you know the overall picture a bit more, and you can account for some of the variance that comes in and guys changing things, guys' abilities adapting. And yeah, I think that's Greg summed it up pretty well there. There's no reason to look at the longer term sample for Ryan Zimmerman because he's getting older. We all get older. Like compare yourself at 20 to you at 28. It's not going to be the same thing. And Ryan Zimmerman going to be the same, even though he's a pro athlete. Let's go to the St. Louis side, and then we'll do some money time. St. Louis 4.6 implied runs going against Joe Ross. Joe Ross, not a guy who gives up a ton of power, only a 2.2% home run rate since 2019. Didn't pitch a whole lot over the last year and change, so not a lot to look at there. But St. Louis, I feel like in this spot, I don't mind St. Louis very much. Does seem like they have a better chance of being a top stack than their ownership is currently. Ross, I think still, even though he doesn't give up a ton of power, going to let some guys get on base, 1.6 whip overall, 5 xFIP. Numbers aren't great for him. So St. Louis, to me, I think a perfectly fine play. I would be more inclined to stack them up, I think, to take a one-off because I don't see any crazy power numbers jumping off the page here. And I feel like this is a spot where it could be more of a death by 1,000 cuts than one guy just having an outlier day in terms of power.
Yeah, I have a little bit of interest in Joe Ross as a contrarian option. He's picking up almost no ownership. He was decent his first start of the year against the Dodgers. And like you said, he opted out of last year, so we didn't see him pitch last year. He gets hurt also every single season. So he didn't pitch at all last year, which maybe for a guy who's been hurt as much as him, formerly one of the top pitching prospects in baseball, maybe the time off allows him to get healthy and it could serve as a benefit. Or, maybe I'm just looking for a little bit of confirmation bias to say like, hey, I'm playing Joe Ross in 15% of my lineups. That's about 3x the field. I'm looking for other reasons to like him. But I mean, it's mostly a price point play that, and the pitching options aren't great for this slate. But he was okay in his first start of the year against the Dodgers. And then if you look at the recent data, there's just nothing there. He's been hurt. So 64 innings in 2019, 16 innings in 2018, 73 innings in 2017. But the thing that I go back to that kind of makes me most encouraged about his start, his first start of the season, like we said, first time he's pitched in a really long time, 93 miles per hour is average fastball velocity in that game against the Dodgers. So even with all the time off, there's still velocity there. I don't feel great about it, but if I just look at the other pitching options on the slate, unless I wanted to go Corbin Burnes and Kent Smaeda in 100% of my lineups, which is viable. People could do that if they want. That's not how I'm choosing to attack this slate. I have to find other guys to go to. And I think that Joe Ross is a contrarian play. Seems to make some sense. And I'm really basing a lot of it on just the velocity that he showed in 5 innings in his first start in 2 years.
And I'll say to your credit, I mean, the projection on Joe Ross to me doesn't jump out very much. So the price point I think is appealing. I feel like the 5 guys that strike out above league average in the Cardinals lineup look good. And bottom of the order too, just guys who are mostly unproven and or good, plus Adam Wainwright, where you have Justin Williams, Lane Thomas, Edmundo Sosa, and then Wainwright. Theoretically, those guys probably not going to have a lot of production. I guess Sosa's shown a little bit of ability to get on base, and Thomas has shown some pop, but this is all small sample size stuff. So I don't hate the idea of just taking kind of a weak lineup and hoping the guy can survive. I just like, how deep do you think Joe Ross pitches though? Because I feel like for him, with him not having a ton of strikeout ability, he's got to go fairly deep, and I just don't know that he can.
So in general, that would be more of a concern for me on a full baseball slate. But all right, so let's talk about the outcomes where Joe Ross ends up being successful on the slate. He doesn't necessarily have to put up a massive fantasy score, but the ownership on Kenta Maeda is so high on DraftKings. By the way, FanDuel, there's no reason to consider Joe Ross. But so talking from a DraftKings perspective, for him as an SP2, let's say Kenta Maeda just doesn't pitch well against the Red Sox, doesn't have a good fantasy game. Now we're in a situation where Corbin Burns, I think, is very, very likely to end in the optimal lineup. But then we look at the SP2 options. If Kenta Maeda doesn't pitch well, that's already half the field is gone. Now, the other options, I don't think that anybody has significant upside, right? Like, I don't think that Nathan Eovaldi is crazy. It has some like crazy better odds of having upside, especially against a tough Twins team, than somebody like Joe Ross has. I don't think Adam Wainwright has a strikeout upside. Corey Kluber, he hasn't pitched well this year. So then you start to look at the outcomes, and you could kind of say like, hey, maybe 12 to 13 DraftKings points at Joe Ross at a cheap price point is enough to land in the optimal lineup. So I don't think that he has to have a big game. I think that he just has to pitch okay, and Kenta Maeda pitches poorly, and that's where he lands. That's where he lands in the optimal lineup.
Okay, I think it's reasonable, and that's honestly kind of how I feel about Adam Wainwright, but with a little more concern, just better hitters going across from him. But yeah, that's, I think, a reasonable way to look at it, and definitely approach. Sometimes you have to take an MLB for a 5-game slate, just hoping one team fails, and then the pitcher just hangs in long enough to give you a useful number. And I think 5-game slate definitely allows that a bit more. But we are at the halfway point of the show. Just got an ownership update as well. So let's flip the hat and do a little money time here and give you guys the top 5 owned plays for the early slate on DraftKings and FanDuel. And there's a sound effect. Thank you, Tyler. Tyler's too busy playing GTA role-playing games at all hours of the day. So worry about my cash register sound effect. How dare you? Number 1 on DraftKings, Corbin Burns, 66%. Number 2, Kenta Maeda, 58%. Number 3, Gary Sanchez, 40%. Number 4, Aaron Judge, 36%. And number 5, Rougned Odor, 36%. Greg, that's top 5 on DraftKings. We're going to get to the rest of the games here, but let's do this fast. Who stands out as being over-owned? Because I think it's still Odor to me. I like some of the other value plays a little bit more. Gardner going to be less owned and cheaper. I feel like that's the play that I would make. Yeah,
I'm surprised that Gardner isn't super popular.
He's not far behind now. He came up to 35-ish.
But still, like, Odor's in my player pool, but not like significantly more owned than any other second baseman. Like, second base, I find to be a pretty difficult position to fill on this slate, and I'm pretty flat on it. It's just a bunch of guys that I just have grouped in together. So Odor, especially because he doesn't have a great lineup spot, he's sitting 8th. I find that him to be a little bit too popular.
Okay, that's fair. And on FanDuel, the top 5, Corbin Burns, 54%, Aaron Judge, 39, Gleyber Torres, 37, Juan Soto, number 4 at 36%, and Mike Trout, the exact same ownership at number 5, 36% for him as well. The top 5 on FanDuel, I feel like these guys really isn't anybody I would nickel and dime. The price on Gleyber Torres as well, 2,700 on FanDuel, kind of crazy given the positionality as well. But how are you feeling about the FanDuel top 5? Does anybody jump out as being overowned? And if it's one of Soto or Trout, I would strongly disagree. Greg, don't go against those 2 guys.
No, I think that both, especially because it's pretty easy to roster kind of whoever we want on FanDuel. Yeah. I think that makes a whole bunch of sense that they're popular. I would still say that I think Brett Gardner should be higher owned on FanDuel, though, just given that he's nearly min price, and he is really what enables you to easily fit in guys like Trout and Soto.
This guy Josh Gillum defending BVP and DVP in NBA accurate as hard as he can. I think we made the point earlier, Josh. You can play how you want; it's just not going to be a plus EV strategy over time. But that's what DFS does. It allows you to paint the picture you want with the canvas out there. And if you just want to shit on a painting, then just go ahead, Josh, and make it all BVP and DVP all day. Just not the most provable thing over time. But let's get to our next game. Cubs 3.2 implied runs going against Corbin Burns. The Cubs, as Greg mentioned earlier, going to be a weaker lineup today. No Chris Bryant. Some just generally not a lot of power in this lineup. I guess Happ and Peterson, the two bats that you're probably most concerned about. But Burns' stuff has been so nasty over the last year. The longer-term sample also looking good, going back to 2019 at 35% K rate, 16% swinging strike rate. That'd be the best mark on the slate. Going back to last season, a 0.9 whip, 2.7 xFIP, 38% K rate. The guy's just been a monster, Greg. And I feel like this spot against the Cubs, 5 strikeouts in the lineup, not a great implied total. I find it hard to nickel and dime Corbin Burns, other than the fact that, just not playing him would make you different from 66% of the field right away on DraftKings. But I still think that's probably that's got to be the minimum ownership you'd have from.
Yeah. And so if you're playing on Fanduel, I would honestly find it hard to not be close to 100% Corbin Burns, especially because there is no Kenta Maeda or Nathan Eovaldi to consider for that slate. I have Corbin Burns in a little over 90% of my lineups on DraftKings right now. And the only reason it isn't 100 is because I have a few Cubs stacks as leverage plays. But I mean, Corbin Burns is my highest rostered player on the slate by a really, really wide margin. He's been really good this year. I do have bets on him to win the Cy Young this year. So maybe something else where it's like, maybe there's a little bit of bias there for me, but also it goes hand in hand where I say like, hey, if there's a player I bet on or I've drafted a lot in yearly leagues, it's probably because I think that guy's really good. And that's also probably why I'm going to be high on them for DFS purposes also. But Corbin Burns off to an excellent start of the year. I think you could make an argument that he's been the best pitcher so far in baseball. It's only been a couple of starts, but still, I mean, we're looking at 12 innings. He has 20 strikeouts. The command is under control, which is really the big thing with Corbin Burns, because he's always had excellent stuff, but there's been times where we've seen him either yanked from games early or struggle because he just couldn't throw strikes. If he's going to be throwing strikes this year, he's just going to be nearly unhittable. So especially on a slate where there's just nobody else to roster from a pitching standpoint, just Corbin Burns is an obvious play.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. The Cubs do have a better chance of being a top stack than their ownership, perhaps because of everybody playing Corbin Burns. How are you feeling about playing some Cubs here? Because I do think there's enough pop to try to go against some of these guys, especially, the one thing that Burns has struggled with is lefty power, 200 ISO allowed, 3.5% on run rate, though he actually gives up more home runs to righties. Just the overall numbers gives up more hard contact to lefties. You do have some lefties in this lineup. They're putting 4 guys up top who are going to be hitting from the left side of the plate with Happ, Sogard, Rizzo, Peterson. You still have Hayward in there too. I think playing some Cubs is not crazy to me. The implied total wouldn't make me want to put a bunch, but they're one of few teams that aren't over leveraged here. So how are you feeling about playing the Cubs despite pretty ugly implied total?
Yeah, I have, let's see, how many stacks of the Cubs I have. It's very little and just solely only for leverage purposes, but I have 3 Cubs stacks right now. And those are almost all of my lineups that don't have Corbin Burns right there. So just because I have over 90% Corbin Burns in my lineup, I felt just for hedging purposes, it made sense to have a couple of Cubs lineups in there. But still, I don't really have any real interest here. And then even something that I lowered a little bit and took a couple of those stacks out just because we had, no Chris Bryant in the lineup, and the lineup's so much thinner than what we normally see.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. Let's talk Milwaukee side where, as we mentioned earlier, as Greg mentioned earlier, that Christian Yelich not in the lineup once again. Dan Vogelbach hitting in the 2-hole is one meaningful change going against Jake Arrieta. And it's kind of the same case here. Arrieta, very bad versus lefties in a notable way, a 4.4% home run rate compared to 2.1% going against righties. So under league average for him performance in terms of going against righties, but way over league average in terms of the power given up against lefties. And you are getting a ton of lefties up top. I think the Milwaukee stack, Greg, to me, this is one spot where I do like getting some Arrieta because there's a lot of strikeouts in the lineup. Now, 8 guys who strike out above league average in this Milwaukee lineup, but it still wouldn't shock me to see power going the other way. So I think getting in a mix of some Brewers, getting in a mix of some of Arrieta seems like a move to me, even though Milwaukee stack going to be a little bit over-owned according to the top stacks. So I think this is a spot I would just want to get some exposure to because this situation to me seems like the most volatile one it could be good for the pitcher, could be good for the hitting, and really neither part would shock me.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being honest, I find it very unlikely it's going to be good for Jake Arrieta. I think he's a little bit too expensive, and he's a guy who just doesn't strike people out. And there's always been this weird kind of thing with Jake Arrieta where he does not have very many good DFS performances, but he's never a value pitcher either. So like on DraftKings, when I'm looking at like, okay, who might I want to roster as an SP2 with such weak pitching options? And we've got Jake Arrieta's priced all the way up to 8,500. It's hard for me to believe there's much upside there. But his price just never really goes down. Even his first start of the year against the Pirates, he was relatively expensive in that start too. So Jake Arrieta is somebody I can't remember the last time that I rostered him, and I don't think it's going to be anytime soon unless his price starts to go down. There's there's just not enough strikeout upside for him, and a guy whose velocity has dipped really significantly compared to when he was one of the best pitchers in baseball.
I think that's reasonable. I think to me, the thing that just always jumps out is I do track pretty heavily the just amount of guys who strike out above league average in a lineup. And when you have 8, like that's a pretty big number where I've seen, pitchers who are equally crappy, comparably crappy to Jake Arrieta have decent days. And I'd say, not the highest run total here for this one in Milwaukee, plus the fact that Arrieta stuff, I agree, not great, but he also doesn't give up a ton of power. He's the kind of guy that I think can sort of cobble together that mediocre day we were talking about with Joe Ross. Obviously, the price point, you're right, is you're paying definitely a lofty fee for that. But I think if you can get there in some stacks, if there are some spots that you can play him on DraftKings as your SP2, I wouldn't be opposed to playing some Arrieta just because I think he can cobble together something against a lineup that's now got a lot more strikeouts and just, one less really potent hitter with Yelich still out. Anything else on this game for you or anything meaningful for you in the Milwaukee stack side that you want to bring up?
Nope. I have my lineups are just updated now, so I'm just kind of curious to see. They're updating for the Minnesota lineup that just came out, so I'm curious to see if that really changed anything for me. Nope, still 0% Arrieta, so that did not change. I just wanted to make sure that he was a total fade for me before he got off the game.
Well, Jake Arrieta's got a make-a-wish from some kid in the Chicago area, and he's going to come through with a Kerry Wood vintage day. Just like a 28% aggregate K rate in that Milwaukee lineup. That's a big number for any pitcher to get some results. So I will say that I'm going to put my stamp of non-approval on it. Jake Arrieta, my guy to get more than 4% of today on DraftKings. Put it on the screen, Tyler. Please quickly make a graphic of a stamp saying play Jake Arrieta over 5%. Let's go to our next game. This is the one that Greg talked about. And actually, quick note, because we had a question in the chat about the full slate. Tune into the MLB Live Before Lock show coming up at 4 p.m. Eastern, because they're going to be talking about the main slate today. We had to split it up because we want to make sure we're accurately covering each slate that has some meaningful GPPs up top. So we are covering the early slate. We'll have Terry, Alex, and Max coming up at 4 p.m. Eastern covering the late slate. So keep that, or not the late slate, the main slate that is later than this one. So tune into that coming up. And of course, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you'll know whenever we have shows coming up. Here's another game that is going to be, as Greg talked about earlier, not on Fanduel, is on DraftKings, so we will hit on it here. Boston 2.7 implied runs against Minnesota 3.3 implied runs. And I'm seeing in the chat that the Buxton gets scratched while we were doing the show. I think that is the case here. So let's see what this new Twins lineup is. Twins rolling out Arias, Polanco, Cruz, Kepler, Astudillo, Kirilloff, Cave, Jeffers, and Riddle. I guess does not having Buxton in there change anything for you with the Twins? I guess we weren't really trying to play the hitters too much anyway, so I presume that doesn't matter too much to you.
I'm bumping up Nathan Eovaldi because it's a slightly weaker Twins lineup than we would normally see. Eovaldi is also already really popular. So I'm just kind of trying to figure out where that ownership is going to come from. For me, I guess we haven't talked about him yet, but I assume it looks like I'll have a little bit less Griffin Canning than I was going to have otherwise. Joe Ross, not that I was super high on him, but he looks like somebody who I'm going to go from like 15% Joe Ross, maybe something like 10% as I get to a little bit more Eovaldi. But yeah, I think that Eovaldi now is pretty comfortably the third best pitching option on the slate. Corbin Burns being 1, Kenta Maeda 2, Eovaldi 3. There's kind of tiers, and then it's everybody else.
I have to put Alex Kirilloff into my sheet because apparently he wasn't a player of note to me before now, and I'm putting that in so I can get my full picture here. But I agree. I think that having Buxton in there has certainly been playing well by the standards of him, showing more pop than I think people would expect as well. It seems like a good spot, but Eovaldi, the numbers for him versus lefties give me some concern. This is like the theme of the slate for me. I'm usually not this lefty fixated, but 252 ISO giving up to lefties for Eovaldi, 5.6 xFIP, and he's going to get some guys in there. Kepler, Arias can get on base, not a power guy, but Kepler really is the one that worries me hitting in the 4 hole. And you have a bunch of lefties in the bottom of the order too. Eovaldi, man, the price point looks good. The projection looks good. I guess I can't argue it too much. I do think Minnesota, though, I wouldn't be opposed to taking one-offs here a little bit more, just because I think there's a high possibility of one of these guys taking him yard, and he could still have a good day if that is the case. So I guess that doesn't necessarily lend credence to not playing Eovaldi, but I think the Twins to me just gaining a little bit of appeal just because there's going to be more lefties in here than I initially thought.
So with Eovaldi, I have him in 20% of my lineups right now. So the field has him at 27%. So I have a little bit less Eovaldi than the field has, but I was going to be somewhere in the teens. I think I had him like 13 or 14% before I did this latest update. The thing, though, that matters to me more than there being more lefties in the lineup is just that there is no Mitch Garver in the lineup. There is no Byron Buxton in the lineup. like at a certain point, there's a trade-off where it's like, all right, he's worse against lefties, except we're also getting significantly worse hitters in the lineup. Like Byron Buxton is one of the most valuable players on the Twins. So him not being in there, I still have to consider that an overall positive for Eovaldi. Then the other pitching options just suck on this slate. Like if there's probably 2 more games today, I probably don't have interest in Nathan Eovaldi. If there's 4 more pitchers to choose from in 2 more games, but I mean, the other options we've talked about, and there's Corbin Burns, there's Kenta Maeda. Both of them are very clearly strong pitching options. But unless you want those 2 guys in all of your lineups, you have to roster somebody else. So that's really the main reason I'm getting to some of Eovaldi.
Okay. No, it's reasonable. And he certainly did start the year pretty well, or has started the year pretty well. And over the shorter term sample size, I think has shown some signs of life going through just to 2020 here, 3.4 xFIP, which is down from a 4.2 going back to 2019, giving up a little bit less home runs, 3.3% home run rate compared to 4.4. So Eovaldi's definitely shown some upside. I just still don't hate the idea of taking a one-off against him, because I think he gives up at least 1 homer in this game would be my prediction there. Anything else for you in this game? I feel like any overarching thoughts on the Dow of a 7-inning game that we're playing here with a doubleheader?
Yeah, it's tough. Like, and I mean, if you do look at our top stack, so like we have the odds of the Red Sox or the Twins. I mean, the Red Sox 3% chance of being the top stack, the Twins a 3.5% chance of being a top stack, and that in itself doesn't even incorporate that it's only a 7-inning game instead of a 9-inning game. So it's really hard for me to reasonably say there's that much upside in stacking these teams. I have a couple of them as one-offs because if somebody hits a home run, it doesn't matter. But overall, I think that we have to weigh that 7-inning concept, pretty heavily. And I went otherwhere. I went pretty much everywhere else with my stacks. I have 1 Red Sox stack and 1 Twin stack.
We didn't talk much about the Boston hitters here, and I feel like that's, certainly something you mentioned earlier in the show. You're okay taking a one-off, but in terms of the one-offs you might take against Maeda, a guy who, for the most part does kind of take care of business against both sides of the plate. So finally, one pitcher here who I don't have to talk about his lefty splits being completely egregious, but is there any Boston player who you would be more inclined to take as a one-off? Because the prices on JD and Bogarts and Devers in the middle of the order are completely outlandish, but clearly those are the guys who have the most upside in this lineup.
No, I'm looking through my lineups. I just don't have them. Maybe I'm overcompensating too much for it being a 7-inning game instead of a 6-inning game, but I have 1 lineup with Verdugo. I have a couple of lineups with JD Martinez, but I mean, I'm just not really getting to these guys with any real regularity. And it's just because of everybody getting nerfed a little bit because of the 7-inning thing.
Yeah, the 6K price tag for JD Martinez, a little aggressive for a 7-inning game, but more power to him, I guess, getting that number on him. We got a question on the Slack, and this DFS amateur sent me a DM. To be clear, please don't send me DMs when I'm on the show, because I'm not going to be able to answer them. I'm not going to bother me, but it's just I don't pay attention to him, so you're not going to get an answer during the show. But we have enough time here to answer this question for him. He's listening and wondering if we could talk about what size game stacks did you use in the early slate. I would still say for the most part on DraftKings, you're trying to get to 5-man stack as your base, and then maybe you're getting a little more in the ways of one-offs or 5-2-1s, but on Fanduel, I'd presume you're still also trying to get 4-mans. But do you feel any differently, Greg? I think you're still trying to capture the one outlier effort that one team is inevitably going to have on the slate.
Oh, I hate to one-up you here, but he also DM'd me, and I already answered him in my DMs
while
we were doing the show. So
he knows how to get results, I guess, even though this is not the optimal way for us normally as hosts. On an NBA Live Before Lock show, boy, that question's never getting answered.
I hate to say it, but I do answer my DM. I can't answer all of them, but I do. I try to answer as many of the DMs as I can. But
is that the Make-A-Wish thing that you've been doing?
My personal Make-A-Wish things just want more attention. So anybody who DMs me, I just eat it up, because I don't need to eat food. I don't need water. I don't need liquids. That's probably not true. I've been drinking water bottle during the show. But what I really need is attention. I need engagements on social media. That is my form of photosynthesis. As long as I get attention, I'm good. But anyway, just to read off what I answered to him in the Slack chat is, I only make 5-man stacks on DraftKings for the most. There are certain situations where I'll change it. If it's a 2 or 3 game slate and it's not always viable because of whatever the pricing is. But for the most part, I only make 5-man stacks on DraftKings, and then sometimes it'll be 5-3 stacks, sometimes it'll be 5-2-1, sometimes 5-1-1. But the core of my lineups is always making 5-man stacks for DK, and then 4-man stacks for FanDuel, sometimes 4-4, sometimes 4-3-1, 4-2-2. But I'm always have one team that I either have a 5 or 4-man stack of.
Okay. Yeah. I think you're still the 5-man base to me is always going to be the most important on DraftKings. And especially I think on a shorter slate, it's kind of like what we talk about with NBA where people are, more inclined to game stack when you have 4 games or 5 games. Like you're basically doing that every MLB DFS slate, but especially I would say on a shorter slate like this one, there's going to be one team who has guys just going nuts and batting around the order and all that stuff. That's just how it always goes in these shorter slates. So you're trying to capture that the best you can. And I'd be more inclined to get, I think, more in the ways of 2-mans and 1-mans and one-offs and all that stuff rather, and on a shorter slate than this one. But 5-3 is going to be the optimal always. I know Steve Buzzard, DeColts, who's won a lot of money recently on some of the sites, always tries to go for 5-3s when he can. And talked about in some of the game plan videos. And that's generally the approach that most pros are going to have because you're going to get better results night in and night out rather than trying to capture the sort of random slot machine approach of just playing a bunch of dudes. Last game on this early slate here, we got the Angels 4.3 implied runs against Brad Keller. Also on the other side, we have Kansas City 4.2 implied runs against Griffin Canning. And the Angels stack, Greg, I feel like it looks pretty good relative to the top stack. Sewell, 15% chance of being the top stack, 11% aggregate ownership. Going against Keller, not a spot I normally love just because he doesn't give up a ton of power, but lots of ways for these guys to get on base and get decent results. So how are you feeling about the Angels? And does anybody jump out for you, I guess, besides Mike Trout?
So for starters, this is my second most rostered stack behind the Yankees. Yankees number 1, Angels being number 2. Shohei Ohtani just does not get priced up, and we don't have an Angels lineup, I don't think, or at least we hadn't as of 5 seconds ago. And yes, still no Angels lineup. I don't get why Ohtani isn't more expensive. Like he should be priced up a lot more, and just DraftKings never ever does it. So Ohtani, his price has actually gone down. He's 4,300. He scored over 20 DraftKings points now in 3 of his last 4 games. He's proven to be one of the most exciting, one of the most fun players in baseball with his ability to be an ace starting pitcher and his ability to apparently now be one of the best hitters overall in baseball. But his salary now over the last handful of games, 4,600, 4,500, 4,500. And I keep saying, why is he not more expensive? And he's going the opposite way, now 4,300. So Shohei Ohtani is overall one of my most rostered hitters on the slate. I actually have more exposure to Ohtani than I do to Mike Trout right now just because of the price point.
How are you feeling about Jared Walsh? Because he's the one guy in the stack that seems like he's getting no ownership, but the pop has been there for him. Not the biggest sample size, but going against righties, a 306 ISO and a 180 at bats. Like Walsh to me, not a great price point, but on DraftKings dual position eligibility, so you could play him alongside Ohtani if you want. You could play him alongside Trout. I feel like Walsh to me just seems underowned where you're going to have so much ownership going to Ohtani and Trout and really not a lot going to a guy who's hitting cleanup, has going to have guys on base in front of him and has clearly shown some power ability.
I am slightly overweight to the field on Jared Walsh. The one thing, though, is just, like you said, the price point. That prohibits me from getting to him a little bit, but still I'm overweight to the field on him. It is weird to me, and something I've said on previous shows, too, when talking about Angel stacks. I don't understand why Walsh is more expensive than Ohtani every single slate. So Jared Walsh, who, just looking at his recent results, he has scored a grand total of 12 fantasy points across his last 3 games. He has scored 7 or less DraftKings points in all but 1 game this year. Yet Shohei Ohtani, who basically seems to put on some kind of highlight where he had, like I said, 20 plus DraftKings points in 3 of his last 4 games, he's $400 less expensive on DraftKings than Walsh. Just the salary there doesn't really make sense. So yeah, like I said, I'm a little bit overweight to the field on Walsh. Number 1, because the Angels are my second most used stack. And then number 2, like you said, the power upside, but it's hard for me to get to him, say, more than somebody like Ohtani.
Are you getting more 5-mans or 3-mans with the Angels? I know you said they're your number 2 overall, but is there more of a split that you're getting one way or the other? Because it does seem like the ownership right now, not quite going to 5-mans nearly as much as it is to a 2-man at least, I guess, or maybe even 3-mans, but it does seem like the 5-man going to be underowned.
Yeah, I have 15% 5-man stacks to the Angels right now. And then also there's also 3-man stacks, and they're a smaller percentage. There are 2-man stacks, and then looks like a couple 6-man stacks too, just because that's going to be one with Griffin Canning, though, as the pitcher. Obviously not 6 batters from the Angels. So I guess actually if I weigh that all together, then that means that I have, 19% 5-man stacks, just because the 6-mans that have Griffin Canning. But yeah, so that's where I use them the most, is as full 5-man stacks.
Here's an interesting question from El Negro Loco. Our news god is always doing his job as best he can for you guys, for NBA, for MLB, around the clock. So make sure you're showing him a little love, following him on Twitter, and just generally being nice is what I would say for our news god here. But he's asking if you'd go to Soto or Ohtani. I like the price point on Ohtani. I would still favor Soto, though. I think Soto has really big upside. Ohtani clearly does too, as Greg was talking about, has had the big fantasy days recently. But I feel like for just pure upside, I would favor Soto. But clearly Ohtani at his price point, I think would be in more lineups.
Well, we know that our friend, the news god, plays on Fanduel, where Soto and Ohtani basically have the same salary. So for me, then I just go to Soto. And oddly, not a big ownership difference between them either. At least in the last one I looked at, Soto 23% owned on Fanduel, Ohtani 17%. And that's with Soto being 4,400, Ohtani being 4,300. So with everything else pretty much the same with them, I just go Soto because I do think that he's the better fantasy play overall.
Okay. Yeah. Same page there. Any love for Brad Keller at all for you? Another guy who, is cheap and theoretically could cobble together a day with duct tape and just hanging in and not giving up a ton of production and probably not getting a lot of strikeouts for himself. Just a 15% K rate over the last season and change. And really no signs of life here that's going to be any different today. The one thing going for him though, is he doesn't give up a lot of fly balls. So it's possible, I guess he hangs in long enough to be useful at his price point, but I just feel like I have to make this argument here because he's cheap and there's a world where he can get you 15 and that somehow is enough on the slate.
I have one lineup with Brad Keller now. I think I had a few more before, but after I updated Eovaldi to get him to pop up a little bit more with Byron Buxton out of the Twins lineup, it looks like that took Brad Keller almost entirely out of my player pool. So I have one lineup with Keller. It's a tough matchup against the Angels, so nothing really of interest there.
And the Royals, another team here, a slightly higher probability of being a top stack than their ownership. Also, the value seems to be there a good amount as well. 7% chance of being the top value stack on the slate. Going against Griffin Canning, who I think, has the strikeout ability, does strike out guys over league average, a 25% K rate, going back to 2019, but gives up some power here that I don't hate the idea of going to the Royals. Salvador Perez, his price point continues to be ridiculous, but we know he has the power to have an outlier day at some point, even though it's not going to be there every single day. I think, Jorge Soler too, another guy I never mind getting when he's 3,500 on DK. I feel like this is one spot for me, not quite as volatile as the Arrieta spot I was talking about earlier, where I think the hitters are going to have a good day or Arrieta is going to somehow have one of his better pitching days. But I think the Royals, to me, Greg, appeal enough, but Canning too, I think in play at his price point. So I really don't hate getting either side of this equation.
Yeah, that's how I felt also. I don't really know what to make of Griffin Canning. There was a point in time where he was one of the better young pitching prospects in baseball. He came up and pitched really well when he first broke onto the scene with the Angels, but then he had an elbow injury and he was pitching through, I think it was a partially torn UCL, and his velocity started to dip. So I just want to bring up what his velocity has been so far this year. I mean, he's still young. He's only 24. But the result of the diminished velocity was in the first season where he got called up, he went from striking out 9.56 hitters per 9 innings down to 8.95 last season. And also his velocity off the top of my head did dip also. Yeah, he went from throwing 94 miles per hour in his first season to 92.8 average fastball velocity last year. One thing that's pretty encouraging is it's obviously a really small sample size. We've only seen him throw 5 1/3 innings this year, but his velocity is more in line with his first season in the big leagues compared to last year. Average fastball velocity 93.5 in his first start of the year. So maybe the time off, he's a little bit healthier now. But at the same time, too, also somebody who's been a little volatile in his first couple of years in the big leagues. So he's a little bit overpriced on DraftKings. I don't think there's any reason to consider him on FanDuel, but low priority SP2 option for me. And then also the stacks, a low priority stack option. For the Royals, that is. So a little bit of exposure on both sides, but nothing that I'm overly invested in.
All right, so we got a few minutes left here on the show. I do want to do a home run pick. I feel like we should do a home run pick because we have a live before lock show, not a strategy show. We didn't do it at the halfway point, but who would your pick for a home run be to close us out and to put your stamp of approval here on one more play before we close it?
Let's see. I want it to be somebody, number one, I want it to be somebody who I have a lot of exposure to. I don't want to pick somebody who I don't have in my lineups, but I also want it to be reasonable. How about Juan Soto? We both said we liked him. Popular play. Were you going to go with Juan Soto?
I was thinking about it. He was certainly in my eyes, but it's fine. You got there first. You could do the Ray J if you want. You hit it first.
Well, you did ask me. You could have just said, "Hey, I'm going," because I make up the rules for the 100 yards and a touchdown pick that we do for football on Sundays, and I always make up the rules as we go along. You could have done the same thing, but instead you put the ball in my court.
too generous in my nature, I suppose, but I'll go against Nathan Eovaldi. And I guess by proxy, I'm now backing Jake Arrieta more fully because I'm not picking against him for the home run game. But Max Kepler hitting a home run, taking advantage of the lefty splits against Eovaldi will be my pick for the day. Kepler, 280 ISO against lefties. And talk about Eovaldi, 250 ISO allowed. Two lefties rather, and Kepler, his number was against righties, excuse me. And that's it. Greg, give the plugs here. I'm sure you have more shows coming up today, so tell the people what they are.
Yeah, I'll be doing NBA Live before lock with our friend Josh Engelman. And other than that, I have the Boom Bust article that I wrote that went up on the site. I also have a doctor's appointment. I'll plug that. So yeah, all kinds of stuff going on for me this afternoon.
And I'll be back on the tip-off in 2 hours, right before the Live Before Lock MLB show, the 4 p.m. one. Tune into that as well if you want to hear more about the main slate. It'll be Terry, Alex, and Max taking you guys through all that stuff. And again, watch the tip-off. It'll be me, Kayla, and Eric Lindquist, and a decent possibility you might hear a little Eric Lindquist impression on there because the people always demand more, even though it's becoming more like Mickey Mouse every time I do it. Oh. Anyway, appreciate you guys for watching. Hit the like button before you go. Subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys again soon. Enjoy your days. Good luck.